I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our ENFP webinar. I am Kim Kellaway, Head of Clients and Markets at HLB Mann Judd, and on behalf of the ENFP Strategic Alliance of HLB Mann Judd and Commonwealth Bank. So today we're presenting innovation and technology. Our facilitator is Eloise Newbury, Customer Engagement and Innovation, Commercial Banking, Commonwealth Bank. Our first presenter is Pam Rebecca, Digital Leader, Director, Board Digital Coach and Educator. Pam is a Digital Leader, Board Director of Defence Bank and a Digital Coach and Educator to boards and directors. She has been leading digital transformation and innovation for many years across both financial services and the not-for-profit sector. Pam is the former Chief of Strategy, Innovation and Digital for World Vision Australia, where she had responsibility for leading World Vision's Australia's strategy, digital transformation and innovation program, including social enterprise startups. Prior to joining World Vision, she was General Manager, Digital ANZ Bank, leading digital strategy and innovation, digital banking, online sales, and ANZ's digital transformation program. I think we can rightly say that Pam is an expert in digital, in all things digital. Our second speaker is Tamara. Now, when I asked Tamara how to pronounce her surname, she defined it as this, and I just thought it was just so beautiful. So I'm just going to share that definition with you. So it starts with para, meaning strong, Raja, meaning king, and Singham, meaning lion. So Pararajasingham, Tamara Pararajasingham, Head of Social Impact and Communities at Uniting. Tamara is Uniting Head of Social Impact and Communities. She brings to the role over a decade of experience working with for-purpose organisations in evaluating and designing service models, deeply embedding the voice of lived experience in these, measuring outcomes and translating research to practice through innovation and strategy. In Tamara's current role at Uniting, she looks at the intersection of creativity and evidence. This includes a focus on building the organisation's capability for innovation and bringing greater intentionality to an already deep commitment and long legacy of social innovation. So our presentation today will go for approximately 40 minutes, at which time we will open up for questions. I encourage you during the presentation to type your questions in the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel or the chat room, and the presenters will answer them at the end of their presentations. So over to you, Eloise.
Thank you so much. It's great to have a little bit of everyone's time. I hope the audience out there in the community are having a great day. To kick us off, actually, I'll be handing straight over to Pam. So over to you, Pam.
Thanks, Eloise. And thanks, Kim, and thanks to everybody for coming along today. So I'm going to talk to you about disruptive innovation. So what is disruptive innovation? Innovation is part of a spectrum and it exists in many different forms. And Tamara is going to be talking about innovation from a different perspective. But today I want to focus on disruptive innovation, which creates new markets and reshapes existing ones. One of the key things that distinguishes disruptive innovation is that it attracts non-customers. So the people or non-supporters, the people that today aren't doing business with you. Initially, it doesn't have much impact on the existing players, but as the innovation moves upwards towards in sophistication, it starts to challenge the existing players. So some people who might be as old as me that remember transistor radios, and they're one of the classic examples of disruptive innovation. The original producers of sound were very dismissive of this technology because the quality of sound was dreadful. But the teenagers who took up this technology in droves didn't care about that. What they cared about was the independence and the ability to take their music with them is what mattered to them. And of course, once they had a market for something with non-customers, which in the case of transistor radios was teenagers who weren't buying any sound equipment before, they became more and more sophisticated with the production of that technology and eventually started to challenge the existing providers of sound. So this is one of the classic distinguishing features of disruptive innovation. Initially, it's not a threat, and then it becomes too late to do anything about it. These impacts unleash forces, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this a bit later. So why is it more difficult? What makes it different? Well, too often the conversations about disruption are based on a desire to disrupt. You'll hear organisations say, we want to do something that disrupts the industry, or they have a belief that success only really needs talent, will and mindset to have intent, a belief that we're different. The Kodak example is a frustrating one because it's continually reframed as a company stuck in a mindset that failed to adapt. Let's not be Kodak is what people say. But actually, the reality is far more nuanced than this. For disruptive innovation to be successful, it needs the support system around it to create and nurture that kind of an environment. You can't just challenge the status quo in an organisation with the support system that supports that status quo. It won't go well. These creative and disruptive forces have the power to operate on all aspects of existing business models, and they ignite resistance. The other thing that makes it more difficult is it's unpredictable, yet it's predictably unpredictable. And by that I mean we can predict that it will be unpredictable, and therefore you can intentionally design a support system around it to nurture disruptive innovation. My experience with this and my research on this topic has come up with a checklist of rules that if you work through them, it'll help you increase the likelihood of success. So how should we respond? The intentional design of systems. So rule number 1, there's a checklist of 7 rules that I've got, and I'll take you through each of them. The first rule of disruptive innovation, it has to align at the highest level with your purpose and vision. It can be different from the way you operate today, and it should be, but it needs to actually give life to that purpose and the vision. Alignment is really important. Innovation is hard enough, but the further you move away from your core business purpose, the higher the risk of delivery and success. And when you align to your purpose and vision, it also helps the narrative. The narrative helps to piece it together and is more likely to get the team behind you and give power and consistency to the messaging that you are providing to the organisation. Rule number 2, start with a hypothesis you can test. Disruptive innovation is not an exercise in randomly coming up with ideas that you can throw at the wall and hope some of them stick. Start with some hypotheses. It might be that, in the case of the transistor radio, that we believe that if we had portable music, that would be attracted to a market of people who weren't buying music today. What's your hypothesis? And a couple that you can start and very quickly and cost effectively test. Research and form a view on where you think growth is. So you might come up with a few different ideas, but do a little bit of research around them. Come up with a thesis around where you think growth can be found. State your hypothesis, design some rapid tests around it. Rule number 3, measure what matters most. The idea of this is to reduce the risk of failure. Too often in traditional organisations, you will hear the finance leaders or other leaders say, well, sure, I'll give you money for innovation, but it's got to wash its face in 18 months. It has to bring a return on investment in that time, and you have to demonstrate that or you don't get the money. Well, if only it were that simple. We talk about the startups and all these great tech companies, but what many people don't realise is that it takes them 7 years on average to become profitable. Now, this can be really challenging in the not-for-profit world. You're risking donors' money. So it's really important that you do a low-cost approach to testing your ideas and coming up with the measures that matter, because if you want to make a profit in 18 months, it's really, really difficult to do that. but that doesn't mean that you can't successfully disrupt. So what are the measures that matter? The metrics around user engagement with your experiments that help you validate it are what matters. How many people can you actually get to engage and commit in some way to what it is that you're talking about? I'm not talking about commit with dollars, but it might be commit to attend a conversation about it. Asking people to commit is a market validation. So ROI in 18 months is not achievable, and I'm sorry to tell you that, but you need engagement metrics. That is some way of doing market validations of your measure. Rule number 4, incentives. I'm not just talking about financial incentives here, but think about how things work in your organisation. Incentives need to feed and not starve innovation. If you want people to take a risk and get involved in innovation tests that may not be successful, what message are you going to send when your first experiment doesn't go well? Is that person going to be immediately moved off and sent into a role that's hidden away somewhere? Think about the messages you send with the decisions you take, and those kind of cultural incentives really matter. People need to be rewarded. And when I say reward, it doesn't have to be financial. It's the recognition that the CEO might give, the way that the board speak about things. All of those things matter. Incentives have to feed, not starve innovation. Rule number 5, the CEO and board must get behind the innovation tests. They have to champion it. These tests and experiments will face fierce resistance. I spoke to somebody a year or so ago who was struggling to lead a particularly exciting project that was very disruptive. This person was incredibly frustrated because they hadn't even got the team of people together to get started on this, and they were spending 90% of their time fighting fires against all the people that didn't believe this team, this area, this subject should have been innovated on. And part of the problem here is the CEO supported the initiative, but believed that everybody needed to just play nicely and get on with it, and wasn't prepared to actually go into bat and say, this is a priority and this is what we're going to do and this is why we're going to do it. As a CEO and a board, you must champion this, and you must champion it regularly, frequently and consistently, which goes back to the first rule around alignment with purpose and vision. If this innovation that you're testing is not aligned with your purpose and vision, it's going to be much harder to maintain this narrative in continuing to hold things together and continuing to get a consistent narrative. So rule number 6, it must be set up independently from the core business. Now, this is a controversial rule, but if you're interested in disruptive innovation, I suggest that you read Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which was written many years ago now, but I still think it's the definitive text on disruptive innovation. And all of the research that Christensen did, he found it very rare for disruptive innovation to be successful where the unit running the innovation was part of the core business. And the reason for this is that mature management systems actually allocate resources based on ROI. And if you've got a key product that's bringing in the lion's share of your revenue, and you don't have enough resources, which is basically every business and every not-for-profit, and you're going to rank the priorities based on the revenue or value that you can generate from that. And if you've got an experiment that may or may not deliver a small amount of value in the next 6 to 12 months, then it's never going to get the support, because that's what management systems do. They actually rank things so that you go to the greatest value. So that's one of the reasons. It's not the only one, but it's very, very difficult for disruptive innovation to be set up as part of the core unit. I remember hearing Jeff Dixon, who was the former CEO of Qantas, speak a number of years ago about Jetstar when it was established. And I think Alan Joyce led Jetstar for a period of time. I don't think initially, not 100% sure about that. But anyway, Jeff Dixon spoke about, in the early days of Jetstar, he had to be very clear what were the rules that Jetstar had to follow and what were the ones they didn't. And it was set up as an independent business because it was very disruptive to the overall Qantas business model. And the level of resistance that that Jetstar got from the broader organisation was incredibly intense. And Dixon had to go into bat and intervene on many occasions to say, no, Jetstar don't have to follow these processes. They can be different for these reasons. So having the independence and the cover and support of the CEO is part of what made Jetstar successful. And it's one of the largest profit generators of Qantas. It's obviously outside of this pandemic we're all suffering through. So independence of that area is really, really important for the team to get the bandwidth and the air cover that they need. Rule number 7, learn fast, learn often, spend slow. This one's really important, particularly for not-for-profits when you don't have much money to spend. What are some experiments that you can run that cost you very little, that you can quickly iterate on? If the first experiment doesn't give you what you need, then what's another one that you can do? How can you get an experiment to market in the next 7 days, spending almost no money, so that when you do spend money, you actually have done quite a lot of market validation and you can have a lot more confidence. This is sometimes called fail fast. I'm not a great fan of that term. It's a bit too much emphasis on the fail part of it, and many organisations have enough problems with failure without actually trying to shift the culture to make it focus on failure. But it is about rapid learning and spending very little money. And when you're challenged to get out there and do a market validation and get data back in 7 days, it's extraordinary how creative you can be about the experiments that you want to run. So this is a summary of the 7 rules. Rule number 1, align it to your purpose and vision. Rule number 2, have a thesis and a testable hypothesis. Measure what matters most. It's likely to be around some kind of user engagement. It's not going to be ROI, at least in those early stages of getting this off the ground. Look at your culture. Rule number 4, what cultural incentives do you have? Do they feed innovation or do they starve it? Are you rewarded in your career for taking a risk, or are you penalised when you take a risk? Rule number 5, the CEO and board must be constant champions for the disruptive innovation. Rule number 6, set it up independent from your core business. And rule number 7, learn fast, learn often, spend slow. I love this quote from the co-founder of WhatsApp, Jan Koum. We didn't set out to build a company. We just wanted to build a product that people used. And this goes to the heart of user engagement as your priority. It's not about how much money you make because you won't make any money if nobody's using your product. And that's it from me, and I'll hand back to Eloise. But if you enjoyed this presentation, I do have a weekly newsletter. It's pretty easy to subscribe to. Thanks for having me along.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pam. We are going to be speaking again. So there was already so many good nuggets in there. And if anyone's got any questions, get them ready. Because we'll be hearing more from Pam and Tammy after Tammy's presentation. But over to you, Tammy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eloise, and thanks, Pam. Lots of great insights, which I hope I might be able to expand on a little bit now, or add to. I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm calling in from Western Sydney on Darug country, and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet, and especially when we're talking about innovation, acknowledge the great tradition of innovation amongst our oldest living culture in the world. So I'm going to present today what is essentially a bit of a case study about the organisation I represent, Uniting. And Uniting is a large and complex organisation, but like many of you on the call up, our mission and our purpose is about social justice. We are the services arm and the advocacy arm of the Uniting Church, and we exist to inspire people, enliven communities and confront injustice. We deliver a very wide range of services to do that, everything from early learning right through to aged care, disability, children, youth and family services, alcohol and other drug services, mental health, housing and homelessness, possibly everything you can imagine. And so what I will be sharing though is a reality that I think is common with many of those of you who are on the call, irrespective of what kind of services or not-for-profit you run, which is facing a number of royal commissions, facing the marketisation of our services, a movement to outcomes-based contracting, increasingly competitive funding environment, greater scrutiny from our funders and from our customers, which is great. But all these things require us to innovate. And we also have a very unique history and a lot of pride in our social innovation. So about a year ago, we asked ourselves, what does innovation really mean for us? What's our strategy? What's our impact? And how can we get more intentional and effective in our innovation? And so, like any complex problem, we thought to address it in a design thinking way. So we started off by unpacking the problem. We're looking to find solutions, and now we're kind of at the stage of bringing those to life. I'm not all the way through this journey, but I'd like to share some of the first couple of stages with you. And in the first stage, we asked ourselves, what can we learn from innovation in our sector? What is our innovation portfolio, and how do we approach innovation? And what are our strategic gaps and opportunities to do that better? And so I'm going to share with you some of the answers to those questions, but also another question emerged for us. What are the conditions that cultivate innovation for us? So if we think about it as a bit of a garden, what's the soil? What are the fertilizers we need? Who are the gardeners and landscapers we require so that these green shoots of innovation might flourish and grow? And what's the garden we want to create? So that journey for the last 6 months or so has been, there's sort of two things I'd share if you're looking at taking a similar journey. One is that it takes time. We spent about 6 months in that discovery phase. We conducted a series of interviews from internal stakeholders as well as external experts. We invested a significant amount in understanding the literature in this area. Several organisations have published what it means to innovate for not-for-profits, and the Commonwealth Bank of Australia has some really great publications on that in particular. We did some deep dives into our innovation programs, and we also ran some virtual sort of focus groups through our leaders forums, and I'll share with you some of the results of what it was like when we polled 600 people leaders on their innovation capabilities. The second piece to think about is what needs to be global and what needs to be localized in your innovation strategy. So some things need to be organizational wide, and some things need to really be more pronounced at a stream level or a certain type of program level. And you might want to think about those as business units as well. And finally, we did all of this during 2020, the ultimate experiment, the year where we had no choice but to innovate. And it was a really great opportunity to test out different things, to build our innovation capability, to deep dive and understand what was going on. And I thought I'd just share one of those little experiments with you, or maybe not so little, but a really helpful experiment for us was running a COVID innovation program last year. What we found in around April, May last year was that some of our services adapted and pivoted and shifted towards the COVID realities very quickly and really effectively in creative and meaningful ways. Others, not so much. And so we sat back and looked at what's going on here. What is it about capability and views and vision for innovation that's different? And we sought to run a 10-week program in which we shared a common set of principles, a basic process, and some toolkits to encourage people to innovate. And we use this as an opportunity to learn. And you'll see here that this is what the program looked like. It was for a group of about 15 program managers, and we took them from a range of services, and we asked them and we picked them very specifically because they did have mindsets for innovation, but also because they represented diversity of thinking and experience. And we presented both masterclasses, some coaching calls, and tasks and feedback. It was a really, really interesting program. We learned a lot. First of all, we sort of proved our hypothesis around building capability through connections and design principles and new tools. But also one of the things we started to realize was behind this idea of culture and leadership, there are some specific mindsets of innovators or entrepreneurs that we need to better understand, we need to foster, and we need to grow sometimes. So these are sort of the innovation mindsets that we focused on. And I mentioned earlier, we ran some polls with 600 of our middle managers online to understand a bit of a self-assessment. And what we found out was our managers saw themselves as having great strengths around analytical curiosity, empathy, and collaboration, but needed some more support and confidence to experiment and to be agile. And so this is a really important insight for us as an organization to learn about how do we build our innovation capability and where are our gaps and opportunities to be better. And so we're very much focusing on how can we build experimentation and agility into our innovation practice and into our innovation leaders. The second part of what we looked at was what do we really mean by innovation? And so like many of you, and I'm sure have come across this, too often innovation is characterized by a few flagship or transformative, or sometimes, you know, the disruptive work that Pam talked about. But often in our organization, innovation goes well beyond this. We have a, what we noticed was most of our innovation happens in this baseline sort of continuous improvement or service evolution space. And these are small incremental changes that happen, but they are incredibly important as a foundation to do other levels of innovation. We also at Uniting are particularly strong in the adopt and adapt stage, level of innovation. This is where we find a solution outside of our organization and we look to see if we can adopt and adapt a new service model, a new practice, a new system, so that it may create effective client outcomes for us. And finally, there's that disruptive transformation, which Pam spoke about. The next thing we looked at was what types of innovation do we deliver? And so there are plenty of models out there. This is a really common framework, Doblin's 10 types. This was both helpful and unhelpful for us. Firstly, it was helpful because it helped us to clarify there are actually different types of innovation and we need to know what we're doing and service our innovation practices and our innovation strategies to serve the type of innovation we're doing. But also the language didn't quite resonate for our organization. As a not-for-profit and a community service provider, some of these terms just didn't make sense for us. And it also didn't sometimes recognize this in this model, the intersecting nature of certain types. And so we developed our own typology. It looks like this. Again, this is not a perfect visual because if I was a better graphic designer, I'd probably make this element, the second circle, service evolution, a much larger piece of our innovation outcomes. So up the top, we have social impact innovation. This is innovation purely driven by community need, where our goal is to create systemic change, create a new product, create a new service, create a new practice that is about solving a complex social problem and create change beyond our organization. In the second group, service evolution, we are looking to incrementally improve our existing practices, our existing service models, and we have a focus on individual client experiences. We have a focus on efficiency and effectiveness. And this again is our greatest area of activity. The third is organizational enablement. This is often driven by our corporate services, and this is about creating better systems and approaches such that we can do social impact and service evolution better. So often this is the kind of work that happens in the background, but it's equally very, very important for us. Finally, we looked at how do different organizations approach innovation? What are the different models and structures they use? And we found that some organizations use incubators or hubs, so they may have a specific team that is dedicated to innovation. And as Pam pointed out earlier, for disruptive innovation, this is really critical actually that you pull this out of BAU and it is thought about very specifically and with expertise, and people are given the space to learn, to fail forward and to do all of those things that are critical to disruptive innovation. Our innovation tended to sit in this dispersed model. We had innovation happening within our services, within our service streams, within the business, if you like. And other models you might like to consider is outsourcing to accelerators. So there are plenty of organizations out there that can help you to incubate and accelerate ideas that you have. And finally, there's some work around, there's an option around using innovation funds or challenges to solicit ideas, and then deliver them over time. As I've been thinking about this, one of the things we've realized is that we actually don't have to choose one. It's possible that you can have a hybrid model and you can choose a couple of different models of innovation to choose the type, but also the level of innovation that you're engaging in. And more recently, I've been thinking about another model, a fourth model, the idea of establishing innovation networks. This is another sort of means. Often it comes out of, challenges and those sorts of things. But establishing an innovation network of agents or champions of innovation is really, really helpful, and it can grow your innovation culture, it can grow your innovation capability, and it can ensure that you do get cross-pollination and diversity of thinking happening within your organization. So those are the models. And so now we're thinking, what we've come to realize is now, what are the conditions and culture that cultivate innovation for us? That core question I mentioned earlier. In doing that, we looked at all the literature again, and there's plenty on what are the conditions for an organization. However, and you know, some of you may be familiar with things like the Give Easy Innovation Index, the Commonwealth Bank reports on innovation, the AFR Inventium Innovation Indexes and competitions and things like that. But I found that we needed to really pull all of that together into a maturity rubric for ourselves. And so that's what I'm here to share with you today, is this maturity rubric. It has 9 vectors under which, and each of them is a condition or a reality that you need to achieve for innovation. And it's also about recognizing that each of us, each organization is on a journey, and we may have strengths in some areas and opportunities to improve in other areas. There's no hierarchy amongst these vectors. They all work together, and they all intersect. They all impact each other. And what I would like to do now is actually, maybe instead of me describing each of these to you right now, I'd like for you to get your phones out, and, as we're all far too used to doing right now, scan the QR code, which should take you to a Mentimeter. If that doesn't work for you, you can go to menti.com and use the code 35406213. So firstly, innovation, focus, clarity, and strategy. Innovation succeeds when it's a central part of your corporate strategy, and it's seen not as, you know, a nice to do or a risky thing, but it's seen as risk management. It's seen as future-proofing your business, and your CEO and board are behind it, and you know exactly your purpose and meaning for it. The second element is leadership and governance. Again, innovation requires a certain type of governance. As Pam pointed out, it's not about trying to measure ROI. It's actually, it's about we need board members, executive managers to establish a compelling vision and to bring that to life by authorizing a fostering environment or fostering an authorizing environment where creativity and experimentation is encouraged, and a real focus on purpose and iterative learning is encouraged. And so then we've got culture and mindsets, which I've spoken about already, but I'd also encourage you to think about psychological safety when you think about that, and the ability for your colleagues to raise an idea that you may think is wild or not fully formed. Is your workplace the kind of place where that's safe to do? And then there's capability and practice. So innovation is doing innovation well requires structure and discipline. Without it, organizations will waste precious resources. It's different to our BAU, especially for community services providers. It's not about just delivering a program or operationalizing a service. It is about human-centered design. So have you got capabilities and practice for innovation? So really interesting to see your responses there. I'll ask you to go to the next page. Next, we've got stakeholder centricity. So I think in our sector, we often call this client voice, but have you got deep empathy and engagement with the people for which you're innovating? Are you successfully engaging them, not just in retrospective feedback, but also deeply in co-design and in giving you ideas for and co-creation of new ways of working? Then we've got internal collaboration. So again, the secret ingredient for innovation is diversity of thinking. And that requires several parts of your organization to come together and work together. So internal collaboration is important, but so is external collaboration, looking up, looking outside. One of the challenges we've set ourselves at Uniting at the moment is to consider adjacent sectors and adjacent industries. What can we learn from them? How can we partner with experts to maybe disruptively innovate? Then there's recognition. Again, Pam touched on this. Are your leaders recognizing, supporting, celebrating innovation at all levels when it happens? Is it formally recognised and called out in staff meetings, in newsletters, in every communication opportunity that you have? And finally, there's technology and digital transformation. Of course, we know that innovation is wider than just digital transformation. For many community services organisations, it's actually about determining how technology can be an enabler for what we do already. And, you know, I think everything I've read so far is that unfortunately, not-for-profits don't invest heavily enough in this area. And so how are you going? So really fascinating to see your results. I hope that's a tool you might be able to use with your colleagues, with your board. It's certainly something that's really helped us. This has been a really important piece of the puzzle for us as we develop our capability. It's given us a clue as to where we need to focus and where we need to build and what we might leverage as our strengths as well. Really, really fascinating. And now I'm in the process of going through this at a more granular level and a more micro level with various teams to understand this even better. Look, my final slide is really just to share something else I've been thinking about lately, which is about how do we nest innovation into existing strategies. Innovation is an enabler for so many of our organizations. It cannot be a standalone piece of work. How might we nest it into what we're doing already, whether that's a workforce strategy or it's a business development strategy, or it's a financial sustainability strategy? What are we doing to nest innovation into there? So, and that's the challenge I'll leave you with. Thank you very much.
Not a small challenge to leave in everyone's hands, but that was amazing. So obviously there's so much knowledge here. Thank you both so much for sharing that. So look, just listening to all of that from both of our panel, I think one thing that's clear is the important role that leadership plays and how important people are in all of this. So I'd love to ask Pam first, what are some practical examples that you might have of how leaders show the right support for these types of innovation?
Yeah, thanks, Eloise. I think it's about conscious that leaders have a powerful voice and that the steps that they take resonate throughout the organisation, and being quite intentional about that. So what opportunities do you have to communicate with your team? And are you using all of those opportunities? So if you're having weekly stand-ups, then are you showcasing and talking about innovation? Are you inviting people working in that space to come and talk? Are you actually giving them a voice? Are you amplifying their voices? What are you writing about when you do your regular update or blog or internal social media, whatever it is that you're doing? What messages and what are the underlying messages that you are sending? So it is that consciousness and deliberate nature of what leaders focus on. What matters to our leaders is what matters to each of us. And if you're only talking about the numbers of the organisation and not talking about those other things, then that's all that the teams will also focus on.
Thank you. I can see a comment that's come through from Dr. Jane Meyer-Tucker, thank you, around Tammy's challenge to the group. Some great international work around 7 forms of collaboration, i.e. systemic collaboration, could help pick up on this concept of nested innovation. So there you go. Thank you for that. So Tammy, over to you. Would love to hear your thoughts around leadership for these types of innovation.
Sure. I think, look, Pam's nailed it. It's about recognition and about using your voice as a leader to champion innovation and good quality innovation. I think it's also about encouraging people to take those really intentional approaches. I have seen in my organisation leaders who encourage their staff to slow down, to really frame the problem, give them permission to iterate, to talk openly about, lessons learnt, and not be afraid to talk about failure. I think leaders can do a great job by role modelling, I guess, those mindsets for innovation. And really, I guess, putting together diverse teams, encouraging your teams to look up and to look out. Those are all things that leaders can do.
Yeah, thank you so much. I might stick with you, Tammy, and there's probably people who are on the call now who might be thinking, but, my organisation is a different size to some of the examples that we've spoken about. So, I'd love to hear from you. And I've heard these thoughts before around the difference between how large and small organisations navigate these types of activities.
Yeah, sure. Look, certainly larger organizations have more resources and capability at hand. However, I'd say small organizations also have lots of advantages of being nimble and of being extremely resourceful. I think most not-for-profits are very, very well versed in innovation simply because we have to be, and we've been operating in a scheme of scarcity for so long. And so I would say, first of all, the conditions, so the capabilities and mindsets for innovation don't differ depending on what size your organization's at. And I'd say small organizations may also have a narrow remit, and they might be able to leverage partnerships and leverage opportunities for pro bono work as well. Certainly, I've even as a large organisation have benefited so much from the Commonwealth Bank's investment in social innovation capability for the sector.
Thank you. That wasn't a pre-organised plug. No. Pam, what about you? Your thoughts and experience.
Yeah, I just want to emphasise partnering, and this is something that I've really noticed since I've joined the board of Defence Bank. Having come from a long career in banking with one of the biggest banks, with ANZ Bank, there isn't in big companies in general a real skill and strength in partnering because they have the resources to do things on their own. And I've been so impressed with how well Defence Bank and the mutual sector in general partner. And they find common other mutual banks that they can work with, and they partner together to work on technology, digital innovation, a whole range of things. So I think a partnering skill is something to really build up if you're in a small organisation. And partnering, and that's the way of so much digital innovation of the future, right? Because no organisation, no matter who they are, can create all the things that are going to be leading in the future. So find out who you can partner with would be my insight there.
Thank you so much. And it's a great point. There's disadvantages and advantages for both, various size organisations. There's some real barriers that can happen depending on the how large your organisation is and how complex it is and how mature it is, for sure. Yeah, we experience that in pockets. So the other thing that I am assuming people who are joining us today might be thinking about is the difference in terms of the budget that you might have for these types of activities. So Pam, I'd love to hear from you first, just around funding these activities and if you think about no cost, low cost, or things that are more expensive to fund.
Yeah, I think I certainly noticed obviously a big difference in budgets when I went from ANZ to World Vision, but it wasn't as much of an impediment as I expected it to be. When you're working for a large organisation, particularly in a regulatory sector, then any vendor you speak to is going to come along with, a multiplier of 10 to anything you think you're going to do anyway. Having said all of those things, there's so much that you can do for nothing. We were working on a particular couple of ideas with World Vision a little while ago, and we did basically a paper exercise to test the innovation. I won't go into too many details about what it was, but we created an exercise that, had we decided to launch this, would have been some kind of an app. But it was an exercise and a series of instructions that we wrote out that we gave some of our staff to do, which is, we want you to do this with your family and go through these steps and report back. And we had that out the door within 24 hours. It cost us nothing. And the feedback we got back was so different to what we expected. It was a task for parents to do with their children. And some elements that we had about it, we were, our intuition and our hypothesis was right, but others were completely wrong. And the kids' input and thinking about this was something that we hadn't factored in at all. Now, I'm a parent of kids, kind of in some of those ways, but we learned so much out of it. And had we have continued, as the software vendor we're working with want us to do, to build us this app and launch this thing, some very fundamental things within there we would have just completely missed. So what is it you want to test? What exercise can you do to get immediate feedback from your potential audience? So I don't think that money is anywhere near as much of a barrier as we think that it might be. I could get things done at World Vision for literally a fraction of what it would cost at ANZ. So I never felt money was as much of an issue for me there as it was at ANZ, where I had a massive budget. So that was the irony of it all.
It's a great example as well about just what can be done out of necessity, and how so much more can be achieved. Tammy?
Look, I concur with Pam. It's innovation doesn't have to be expensive. It's about small scale tests and experiments. Google paper prototyping. It's worth better understanding. It's completely free. The other thing I'd probably say is really consider how you frame innovation and innovation costs. Too often it's seen as this risky, expensive thing, but it's actually about risk management. It's about future-proofing your organizations, an investment in your future, and for social purpose organizations, there's a very clear link between innovation and your purpose. So really think about how you frame innovation, and that would be my advice.
Yeah, just we might stick with you. I've just got a great question. I don't know if you've seen it come through on the chat from Leanne Raven, for you, Tammy, just about what's important for partner selection when we think about this external innovation collaborations.
Yeah, great question. Look, I don't think it's actually different to any kind of partnership you're looking at. Firstly, you're looking for somebody or an organization where you have aligned values and purpose. You also are looking for an organization that will complement you, that can bring a skill set or a client group or a community that you can you can probably not access. And you need to foster that. So any partnership has to be fed and nurtured. It doesn't happen overnight. It will probably start in an informal stage and progress to formality, but that takes effort over time. And the other thing to sort of think about is like having a range of partnerships or bringing a coalition together. It's pretty unusual that one disruptive innovation is only going to include one organisation or two organisations. They're often going to include many groups.
Thank you. And you mentioned a little bit earlier this sort of challenge of thinking about adjacency. So people who don't necessarily operate in the same space as you. One of my favourite brainstorming tools that I use is called Parallel Worlds. So for anyone who's joining, if you check that activity out, it can be a really amazing tool to start thinking about who else solves similar problems to us that operates in different contexts. And that can be a way to come up with some ideas for who you might approach to partner with, learn from, collaborate with, see how they do. All right, so then kind of on that note, how can we actually learn from other adjacent sectors? So we might go to Pam first.
I think, as Tamara said, diversity is an amazing tool. So who are the thinkers that you can get in the room? And so it's not just adjacent sectors, it's all of the reading, research, networking, connections that you can have, because you can learn from so many people. Those partnerships are really important, and just building relationships pre-partnership as well. You'll be surprised what can be picked up and used as resources in those particular connections. One of my favourite innovation examples is when a company got a contract to design this particular computer chip that detected impurities in water. And they set up a diverse team with people with really interesting backgrounds. And one of the people on the team was a marine biologist. And when he realised what the problem was, he went and got a bag of clams, and clams open with a far lower sensitivity or higher sensitivity of impurities than what this particular task was looking for. So they were going to do this chip to measure the impurities of water, but what they really needed to do is just work out when the clams were opening. So it's a fascinating example with bringing in somebody with a completely different skill set that actually solves your problem in a way that you would never have imagined.
It's amazing. It sounds like Indigenous wisdom there in action as well. I feel like there'll be some communities around the world that would have known that. Your thoughts on what we can learn from adjacent and other sectors?
Look, I think again it's about partnering intentionally and having your eyes up. I have so the other thing sort of think about is and I think Eloise, you touched on this, is when you're going through an innovation process and any design process, the whole thing is about testing your assumptions. And one of the easiest activities you can do is, I think you called it parallel worlds, is around, you know, ask yourselves, how would I solve this if I were a teacher, a judge, someone completely different? Why not bring those people into your process? One of the things we've done recently is actually we brought in people from adjacent sectors into our steering groups, our steercos, or our governance of particular innovations. An example of that is we have a social innovation we're developing called Links to Early Learning. It's about creating better pathways for people from disadvantaged and vulnerable communities to access early learning. And so we've, of course, partnered with other early learning providers and people who are, you know, policy experts in this space. But we've brought on a partner recently who I'm not going to name yet, but they actually work in software development for children, and for other early learning providers. And they are really fascinating because they really invest deeply in understanding the child's perspective and the children's experience. And they're teaching us so much about how you incorporate that into our design. So it's been a really interesting process to be part of.
Amazing. Well, I think that's it in terms of the time that we've got for questions. I might just give a final plug. I know that the contact details for Tammy and for Pam will be shown at the end of this, and they're very open to being contacted and creating this innovation ecosystem. So please feel free, everyone who's on the call, to join. So I'm going to hand back to Kim now. Thank you so much to Tammy and Pam. That was an amazing discussion. I'm sure everyone got a ton out of it.
Thank you, Eloise, and thank you so much, Pam and Tammy. I mean, that was a fantastic presentation, and there's been lots of feedback in our chat room, so I'm sure that everyone will have so many takeaways to be able to go back to their organisations now and just look at particular points, and for all organisations, whether that's not-for-profit or for-profit. As Eloise mentioned, here are the contact details of everyone. So as we conclude, I just want to thank those who participated in our ENFP strategic planning survey. And we hope that you found the findings in that survey useful. So our next webinar and our next quarter's theme is financial management. So again, we'll be sending out a survey in September. And from that, those findings will be presented in our final webinar for the year in October, November. I would love to be able to say to you all that there will be a face-to-face Christmas get-together. Fingers crossed that we will be able to see each other this side of Christmas. So that concludes our webinar for today. Again, thank you very much to our panellists. Everyone take care and stay safe. See you next time. Bye.